Let's begin on this issue of borders. So, not my decision, says Annastacia Palaszczuk. Murray, just on this, is there an inherent issue with the Chief Health Officer deciding on any exemptions? Because whomever that is, they're likely to say no. They'll think of the health risk. They're not going to think of the humanitarian aspect of this, letting someone into a funeral, for example. That's going to naturally be where they'll gravitate to, isn't it?
I don't think that's a fair characterisation of how the Chief Health Officer is approaching these matters, Tom. I mean, there is a legislated provision from the Queensland Parliament delegating this decision to the Chief Health Officer, but I know from personal experience with cases that I've referred to her and her office that they are taking into account a range of considerations, but most of all, the health risks. I mean, this is not something that's unique to Queensland. There are many other states in Australia where the Chief Health Officer has this power. But funnily enough, we aren't hearing anything about those from the Prime Minister and his LNP mates.
I guess the issue when you see these individual cases, and yes, you say, well, these might be individual cases, but there have been several of them. But the most obvious is a woman in Canberra who had been in Canberra, hasn't visited anywhere else in the past 2 weeks, sitting in hotel quarantine, unable to go to a funeral because of the risk of COVID. No COVID in Canberra for more than 60 days. How can that be any sort of significant risk at all of spreading COVID around Queensland?
Well, Tom, you and I have tweeted at each other about this in the last couple of weeks because I know it's very frustrating for people in Canberra. And obviously the situation that this woman found herself in was a heartbreaking situation. I note that there are other family members who have a different view and are very disgusted at the Prime Minister and his colleagues for having politicised their family tragedy.
We should mention.
Well, they're pretty upset about the fact that the Prime Minister and his colleagues decided to put this all over the media and politicise their family tragedy to a point where they had cameras hiding in bushes at their family funeral. That is a disgusting thing for the Prime Minister and his colleagues to have led, and it just shows that the lengths that they will go to play politics with these important decisions. I mean, the issues around Canberra are tricky. I'm currently sitting at home in home quarantine, and I suspect Gerard is as well, because we went to Canberra recently for federal parliament. But all of the health advice coming to the Queensland government is that there is a risk of transmission through Canberra, not so much through people who live in Canberra, but you know that people travel from Sydney to Canberra all the time, and Sydney does have a community transmission going on. So
and
look, it's frustrating for all of us.
For all that risk, 60 plus days without a case. I mean, at what point do we say, well, maybe the risk isn't that big? 100, 200?
Well, I think the point that we think that is when the health advice to the Queensland government says that it's safe to open up that border, but the health advice at the moment is that it's not. And as I say, the health advice to other Liberal state governments is exactly the same, and no one's asking questions of those governments. It's all about a forthcoming Queensland election.
Okay, it has been asked before. I'll ask that of Gerard now. Are you just as critical of, for example, Tasmania? Very hard and early approach on borders from Peter Gutton when the Premier there. And there were some individual cases of people unable to get to that state as well to visit a dying relative. So is it just as big an issue in terms of the principle of this, what Tasmania's doing?
Absolutely, Tom. I think all states should open bar Victoria. If you look at the statistics, we haven't had a death in any state bar Victoria now for a couple of months. New South Wales has led the way, showing that keep borders open, keep restrictions relatively light, and not have a severe outbreak of COVID. And as for Murray's comments and the Queensland Premier's comments about keeping Queensland safe, why isn't she also revealing the statistics on the number of suicides, the depression, the heart attack, strokes, and the diabetes that aren't being attended to? I've got doctors, I speak to doctors who are saying a lot of the wards are empty because people aren't going to hospital. So it's very easy to say that she's keeping us safe from COVID. But what about all the other ailments that aren't being treated? And why aren't we being given all those statistics so that we can make a proper analysis of the overall health impacts?
Tom, I think it'd be easier to take...
If the Queensland Premier, I'm just going to ask a follow-up on Gerard, sorry, Murray, but where do you sit then? Because if Annastacia Palaszczuk says, we're taking health advice, and the Chief Health Officer, Jeanette Young, has said several times on camera that she believes this border policy is still the right one. Are you saying you don't believe the Chief Health Officer? What's your issue with that approach?
Well, my issue is that she's not giving us all the facts. I mean, there's not, people don't just suffer from COVID, there's good anecdotal evidence that's out now saying that the number of people being attended to heart attacks, strokes, diabetes aren't getting checked. So, I myself have had a number of anecdotal stories about suicides. So it's a whole picture, a whole of health picture that we should be getting, should be communicated, and that's not being communicated. And, she needs to explain why is it that New South Wales, through proper testing and transmission, can keep a lid on the number of active COVID cases, and Queensland can't. So, that's the question I think she needs to explain, is why can New South Wales control it with the borders open, or willing to have the borders open and lighter restrictions, and Queensland can't. And I apply that to all premiers. I'm not taking away the Liberal side here. I think all states should open their borders, with the exception of Victoria.
Tom, it would be easier to believe Gerard and his LNP. It'd be easier to believe Gerard and his LNP colleagues if they made any noise whatsoever about the thousands of Australians who are stranded overseas as a result of the federal government's decisions and its control of borders. It would be easier to believe Gerard and his colleagues if they made any noise whatsoever about other states, particularly Liberal states, but they don't. They're only talking about the Queensland government because there's an impending election.
Said the criticism is the same for Tasmania.
Well, I'll tell you what, I haven't seen Gerard. I haven't seen Gerard. I haven't seen Scott Morrison. I haven't seen one federal government minister say anything publicly about any of those Liberal states. It's just constant Queensland.
Well, you have the busiest border in Australia is the Queensland-New South Wales one, Murray. Let me put this to you. I mean, we hear health advice. Do we need to hear more than that? What is the health advice? Why is there a risk from someone coming from the ACT beyond just the lines? Something more comprehensive that's released and does compare it to other health factors right now, such as missed cancer screenings.
Tom, the Chief Health Officer of Queensland has done a press conference every single day, exhaustive press conferences that cover every possible issue under the sun every day now for about 6 months, flanked by either the Queensland Premier or the Queensland Deputy Premier. There just can't be any possible argument that there's been a lack of transparency.
That's
they have answered these questions ad nauseum, and they have answered these questions.
Health advice, isn't it?
They go through this in detail every day at a press conference, and the only reason the questions keep coming is because the LNP is desperate to win the Queensland election and desperate to distract attention from the fact that they are about to rip millions of dollars out of the economy.
You could say the Northern Territory example was win the election by keeping the borders up. We heard beforehand from Michael Gunner, hey, the borders could be up for 18 months. Hey, presto, soon after the election, a different approach. Wouldn't some cynicism be valid there around whether or not, keeping the borders up until the election is actually also an attempt to win an election?
Well, I'm not across the health advice that was provided to the Northern Territory government, but I can only assume that the health advice they received has changed as circumstances has changed. And in Queensland, the Premier and the Deputy Premier have said that this situation will be reviewed at the end of every month. And if circumstances change, then the decision will change. But they are making very clear that they are keeping Queenslanders safe. And it's a shame that the Prime Minister just wants to keep picking on Queensland. Doesn't he think that we're capable of making these decisions ourselves?
Okay, nearly out of time. Gerard, let me ask you, does more need to be done around getting Australians back from overseas, this huge backlog we have?
Absolutely.
We're keeping the airlines afloat with taxpayer money. So what should be done? What can the government do? What is it not doing?
Okay, so we basically regulate, we don't operate. We've got a resourcing constraint. So let's open up the borders outside of Victoria. Let's get domestic travellers out of quarantine so we can get international travellers in quarantine. And Peter Dutton himself said the other day, he's happy to have more arrivals come in even if we half quarantine.
All right, we seem to have lost that line from Gerard. We're just struggling there, so I might end it there.